Welcome to this presentation on combining sentences method 4 using independent and dependent clauses. So just to recap what we've learned so far, we have learned method 1, which is where you combine a full sentence, a comma, fanboys, and a full sentence. And the fanboys are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Method 2 is the simple semicolon, where a semicolon all by itself is strong enough to hold together two full sentences. And then 3, we learned the fancy semicolon rule, where you use a semicolon, a transitional expression, and a comma to hold together two full sentences. And what these rules all hinge on is that you have two full sentences to connect. But what if you have a fragment in a full sentence? How can we put those together? And that's what we're going to be thinking about this week is, well, first, we need to learn some important vocabulary. And we're talking about clauses. A clause is a group of words that has a subject and a verb, and it can look very different. So the basis is just subject and a verb, like donkey smelled. An independent clause is a clause, so a group of words that makes sense on its own. It has a subject, verb, makes sense on its own. It's a full sentence. It can stand all by itself. So the donkey smelled like stinky cheese. The subject is a donkey, and the verb is smelled, and it's a linking verb, linking the description like stinky cheese back to the donkey. That sounds like a horrible donkey. So full sentence is an independent clause. A dependent clause is a fragment. It is a clause that does not make sense on its own. So it has the subject, donkey, it has the verb, smelled, but what's wrong with it is it fails the part of the full sentence test. Does it make sense on its own? In this case, it fails it because there is a word added to the beginning of it that breaks the full sentence, that makes it dependent. And I want you to pay attention to the idea of independent and dependent. It's like independent and dependent people. An independent clause, it's strong, it can stand all by itself. A dependent clause, like a dependent person, depends upon something or somebody else to hold it up. So with dependent clauses, fragments, it depends on a full sentence or an independent clause in order to stand. So what we're learning this week is, how do you get a dependent clause? Because if you get a dependent clause, you can do interesting things with it. So the recipe for making a dependent clause is you add a dependent word onto the front of an independent clause, and those two pieces together equal a dependent clause. This is how I do math. It's wordy. So here's our example. So after is our dependent word. We're going to add, well, first of all, you have to make sure you have an independent clause. The lazy spotted dog took a walk. So dog is the subject, took is the verb. So we have a full sentence, and we are going to add the dependent word after onto it. And the dependent word after breaks the independent clause, and we're left with a dependent clause that is after the lazy dog took a walk. You'll notice that it's these dependent clauses, they leave you hanging. After the lazy dog took a walk, then what? And that's how you kind of develop a sense to hear that and know that that's a dependent clause. Also, you start to get good at noticing dependent words. So, this is a big list. You don't have to memorize them all. Memorize a handful that you can use repeatedly, and you'll start to recognize them when you see them and know, hey, this is a signal that what comes after it is a dependent clause or dependent on something else. I recommend memorizing the ones you think that you will use most often. I use as, because, if, when. Those are the ones I use most often. And so when, if, as, because, that's what I memorized to remember to use with this rule. So once you know some dependent words, you know how to make a dependent clause, you can do interesting things. There are two ways of hooking independent and dependent clauses. So pattern one is if you have one of each, an independent clause and a dependent clause, you can simply stick the dependent clause at the end of an independent clause. So here's my example. The dog ran. That's my independent clause. And then I'm just sticking the dependent clause onto the back, while the cat napped. And so you'll notice that while is in the middle. While is the dependent word I added to the cat napped to break it. So pattern two is actually exactly reversed. You hook the dependent clause or the fragment onto the front. When you move the fragment to the front, the dependent clause to the front, you have to stick a comma in between them. So in this instance, while the cat napped, that's the same as the original. While is the dependent word. I hooked it onto the full sentence, the cat napped, put it in front, and then I have to hook it on with a comma. It becomes a little introduction fragment onto the full sentence, the dog ran. So those are the two patterns, and you have to pay attention to, is my dependent clause in the front or in the back? And one thing I want you to know with both of these patterns is that you have to stick something in the middle when you hook together these pieces. If the word goes in the middle, the word is all by itself. If the word goes in front, you still have to put something in the middle. So you put that comma. So remember, something always goes in the middle, but only one thing. Okay, so the recipe, how do we use this rule? So let's review. You start with two independent clauses. And the important part is, when you have these, you need to figure out where one starts or one ends and the second one begins. And the way to make sure that you've figured out where that boundary is to cover up part of it. So cover up half. I was young. We have a subject, I. We have a verb, was. I was young. Makes sense on its own. So we're good. We have an independent clause or a full sentence. So we'll cover up the first part. I was a brat. I, subject, was, verb, makes sense on its own. Works well. So we have two independent clauses. Now that we do, we are going to break one of them. And I'm going to break that first one, the I was young. And I'm going to break it by adding that dependent word onto the front, when. So when plus the full sentence, I was young, equals when I was young, which is now a fragment. So now that I've broken it, I can hook it onto the full sentence differently. So if I use pattern one, that means that I hook the fragment onto the back. So I was a brat when I was young is my sentence. And notice the word went in the middle, so I don't have to put anything else in the middle. And then pattern two, I moved that fragment to the beginning. So when I was young, comma, I was a brat. The word moved to the front, so I have to put a comma in the middle. Notice the middle bits. That's the part that tricks most people, is word in the middle all by itself, word in the front, comma in the middle. Okay, I'm about to rock your world. Watch out. Starting sentences with because. Did you have a teacher tell you that you can't start sentences with the word because? I bet you did. I did. They lied. And they lied to you, but it was out of kindness. And the reason is, a lot of people add that word because to a full sentence, remember? And then it makes a fragment or a dependent clause. And then they just stop there. Just like, because I like apples. We talk like that, but it's not a full sentence. It's a fragment and it can't stand alone. And so what they were trying to save you from is having a bunch of fragments. The truth is, if you start a sentence with because and add it to a full sentence, then you're fine. So because I like apples, I ate 7 of them. That's perfectly fine. So you can start sentences with because as long as you hook them to, they're hooked. That fragment part, the because I like apples, is hooked to a full sentence. I ate 7 of them. I would be sick after that, but it's a full sentence. So you have to break that pattern. You can start sentences with because they were being nice to you, but they lied. All right, now that I've broken your hearts, go try the exercises.